When the bell of curfew tolled and streets fell into darkness, one place in the medieval town stayed alive with firelight, laughter, and danger. Taverns were more than houses of drink. They were crucibles where strangers collided, tempers sharpened, and secrets spilled alongside ale. Behind their smoky beams, the boundaries between merriment and menace blurred, and the same bench that hosted song could, within moments, host blood. In a world where the law slept and the night belonged to the bold, the tavern stood as both a refuge and a threat, a place where survival demanded more than a strong arm. It demanded constant vigilance. The first step into a medieval tavern was not a quiet entrance, but a plunge into chaos. Doors creaked open to reveal dim interiors where air hung heavy with smoke from tallow candles and a central hearth, mixing with the stench of spilled ale, sweat, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. In towns like York in the 14th century or Lubeck in the 15th, taverns clustered near busy markets and city gates, placed deliberately to catch merchants and travelers as they entered, and each doorway promised both hospitality and hazard. Taverns were more than drinking holes. They were hubs of town life, woven into the architecture of medieval urban centers where crooked lanes converged and commerce flowed. The names painted on their signs, the Swan, the Boar, the Green Dragon, drew in crowds seeking warmth, food, and company, but the gathering of so many in close quarters made them spaces of tension. In London, by the early 1300s, records show more than 300 taverns operating inside the city walls, an astonishing density for a population of perhaps 80,000. That concentration meant that nearly every street had its corner of noise and trouble. The interior of these places was rarely refined. Floors were strewn with rushes that absorbed spills and filth. Benches and tables pressed together forced strangers to share space, and the low ceiling trapped the haze of fire. A single crowded room might contain peasants fresh from the fields, craftsmen pausing after work, clerics willing to risk disapproval, and foreign merchants eager for news. Each carried their own dialect, customs, and grievances. This mix was not accidental. Town officials often licensed taverns near main thoroughfares because they provided meals and beds to passing travelers. Yet those same travelers brought stories, rumors, and disputes from afar, fueling local unease. When pilgrims returning from Canterbury or Santiago stopped in for a drink, they encountered townsmen protective of their own neighborhoods, creating opportunities for friction. Municipal courts in 15th century, Bruges recorded multiple cases of tavern quarrels escalating into riots after foreign sailors insulted locals or refused to pay their bills. The very architecture amplified danger. A single hearth was the main source of light, creating shadows where illicit deals could be struck or purses cut from belts. Doorways were narrow, making it difficult to leave quickly once a brawl began, and upper floors often doubled as sleeping chambers, where drunken arguments carried upstairs could turn violent before anyone intervened. In Paris in 1292, a royal tax survey recorded more than 1,000 taverns and inns across the city. Many were little more than wooden structures pressed between stone houses, flammable and fragile, where fights could ignite disaster. Inside, the sound was constant, the thud of tankards on wood, the rattle of dice, the scraping of lutes, and the slurred voices of drinkers pressing their arguments louder with each refill. Chroniclers noted that tavern quarrels often began not with clear enmity, but with noise, a misheard word, a boast spoken too loudly, or a jest taken as insult. In 1378, London's coroner's rolls describe a case at the sign of the Cock in Cheapside, where a shoemaker and a fishmonger came to blows after one accused the other of cheating in a dice game, ending with a knife thrust before the watch could arrive. For women, taverns were both opportunities and risks. Alewives, women who brewed and sold ale, often ran these establishments, especially in smaller towns. Their presence gave the tavern a domestic veneer, but it also drew criticism from officials who accused them of watering down ale or tolerating disorder. In 1327, Norwich records show multiple fines levied against alewives for selling poor quality drink, a complaint that often disguised deeper anxieties about the authority of women in public spaces. Female tavern keepers faced danger when drunk customers refused to pay, leading to assaults that rarely found justice in court. Even the simple act of stepping inside was a gamble. A stranger could be welcomed with warmth and food or sized up as a target for theft. The dim lighting hid expressions, and voices rose until it was hard to tell whether the crowd was celebrating or threatening. Taverns promised respite from the cold streets, yet their very walls concentrated the volatile ingredients of medieval life: alcohol, strangers, weapons, and rumor into a single room where one unlucky word could trigger a chain of violence. In the medieval tavern, drink was both the attraction and the danger. Ale, mead, and later imported wines poured constantly from pitchers and barrels, their presence inseparable from the fights, arguments, and scandals that so often defined these spaces. Alcohol was not a background feature, but the very heartbeat of tavern life, a force that loosened tongues, blurred judgment, and transformed gatherings into powder kegs of disorder. Ale was the staple, brewed thick and cloudy, more a food than a drink, consumed daily by men, women, and even children. In towns like Norwich or Ghent during the 14th century, the average adult drank multiple pints each day, not out of indulgence but necessity, since water supplies were often polluted. Yet within taverns, ale was consumed at volumes beyond ordinary need. A man who might sip steadily at home could drink tankard after tankard in public, egged on by dice games, music, and the taunts of his peers. Records from London's coroner's rolls repeatedly list fatal stabbings that occurred after excess of ale, a phrase that recurs with grim familiarity. Mead, though less common in towns than in rural regions, carried its own associations. Brewed from honey, it was more expensive, often served at special occasions or purchased by wealthier patrons. Its sweetness disguised its potency, catching inexperienced drinkers unawares. In Scandinavian ports like Bergen or Stockholm, sagas and court records alike tell of mead-fueled feasts that dissolved into weapon fights. The line between celebration and bloodshed crossed within moments. For sailors and mercenaries, mead was not only refreshment, but a declaration of strength, a boast that demanded defense when challenged. Wine, imported from Gascony into English ports, or from the Rhineland into Central Europe, entered the tavern as a symbol of status. By the late 13th century, taverns catering to merchants in Paris or Bruges stocked barrels of claret alongside common ale. Yet wine drinkers were no less prone to violence. A 1315 complaint in Bordeaux described English merchants who, drunk on local vintages, insulted the townsfolk and triggered a street brawl requiring armed watchmen to disperse. Wine sharpened pride as much as ale dulled restraint, and together they filled the same narrow rooms with combustible tempers. Authorities recognized the danger. Statutes from Edward III's reign in England limited the hours taverns could sell drink, declaring that no ale should be poured after the evening bell. Similar regulations in Lubeck sought to curb late-night drinking that kept citizens awake with quarrels and song. But these laws were often ignored. Watchmen themselves stopped for tankards on their rounds, and tavern keepers eager for coin rarely refused a thirsty customer. The very attempt to regulate drink testified to how closely it was tied to violence. Without ale and mead, quarrels might simmer. With them, blows were struck. The connection between intoxication and bloodshed was more than anecdotal. In York, coroner's rolls from the early 1300s reveal a pattern. Men slain in taverns almost always bore the note that both parties had been drinking. One case describes two tailors who, after competing in a dice game, accused each other of cheating. Their raised voices turned to grappling, and knives soon flashed, leaving one dead on the rush-strewn floor. Chroniclers in Florence echoed the theme, blaming much of urban unrest on vino rosso, which spurred apprentices into mobs and sent rival factions clashing in the streets. Drunkenness also blurred the boundaries of honor. A sober insult might be ignored, but once ale loosened the tongue, slights became unbearable. To be called a liar or a coward in front of one's peers, while swaying with drink, demanded an answer, and too often that answer was steel. In taverns where every man carried a knife or dagger at his belt, disputes escalated with lethal speed. Even women who worked in taverns knew the volatility of drink. Alewives were fined not only for weak brew, but also for allowing disorderly company. The underlying fear was that their alehouses became breeding grounds for drunken assemblies that threatened civic peace. In 1378, the city of Coventry recorded repeated riots beginning at alehouses run by women, a fact used by officials less to protect them than to blame them for male violence. For medieval towns, drink was unavoidable. It nourished bodies, fueled economies, and marked celebrations. Yet within the dim, crowded walls of the tavern, it became an accelerant for chaos. Ale made men bold, mead made them reckless, and wine made them proud. Together, they transformed disputes into brawls, and brawls into killings, ensuring that wherever the barrel was tapped, danger was never far behind. In medieval towns, the tavern was less a private retreat than a crossroads, where every sort of traveler, worker, and wanderer converged. Unlike the household, bound by kinship and custom, or the guild hall, limited to one craft, the tavern admitted strangers. Its benches and tables brought together men and women who otherwise had no reason to meet, and in that mix lay both its attraction and its peril. Merchants on the road from Flanders to Italy might stop at the same establishment where journeyman masons ended their day, and their differences of language, dress, and behavior quickly marked them as outsiders. In Bruges, during the late 14th century, court records note frequent quarrels between foreign traders and local townsmen, sparked not by deep political disputes, but by misunderstandings across the ale bench. To ask the price of a drink in broken Flemish could be taken as mockery. To boast of distant profits might sound like an insult to the struggling artisan at the same table. Pilgrims were another constant presence. Returning from shrines at Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela, they carried badges on their cloaks and stories on their tongues. Within taverns, their accounts of miracles or distant lands clashed with the skepticism of locals. Some listeners resented the way pilgrims were excused from certain tolls or taxes. Others accused them of spreading false relics or fraudulent tales. In 1411, records from York describe a tavern riot after townsmen accused a group of returning pilgrims of lying about the bones they carried, a quarrel that escalated until weapons were drawn. Sailors added to the volatility. Ports like Lubeck, Marseille, or London swelled with crews discharged for the night, their wages paid in coin that quickly found its way across tavern counters. Groups of men who had endured the hardships of the sea now crowded into narrow rooms, competing with locals for ale and attention. Their rough manners and foreign accents marked them as interlopers, and a spilled drink or careless jest could spark hostility. Chroniclers in 15th century Genoa observed that brawls between sailors and townsfolk most often began in taverns and rarely ended without bloodshed. Students, too, were part of the mix, especially in university towns like Paris, Oxford, or Bologna. Young men, freed from their families and flush with their first allowances, crowded taverns after lectures, eager to prove wit and bravado. Locals resented their arrogance, and tavern keepers often dreaded their custom, for students paid slowly, if at all. A Parisian ordinance of 1,342 fined taverners who sold too freely to scholars, blaming student drunkenness for disturbances that spilled into the streets. The tension between transient scholars and settled citizens played out most vividly in the tavern's cramped halls. Even within a single town, divisions of class and neighborhood were magnified when all met under one roof. A peasant selling produce in the market might sit across from a minor nobleman inspecting estates, and what began as a friendly exchange could collapse under the weight of status. A noble insulted by a commoner in the heat of drink could not simply let the slight pass. His honor demanded response. In 1364, a tavern in London's Cheapside witnessed the killing of a knight's servant after he mocked a group of artisans for their rough clothes. The quarrel spread until nearly a dozen men were arrested, proof that a chance encounter in a tavern could ripple through an entire neighborhood. What made these encounters so dangerous was the lack of shared bonds. In the guild hall, disputes were settled by custom. In the parish, quarrels were softened by memory of baptism or marriage. In the tavern, there were no such ties. A stranger might be gone the next day. A sailor might sail with the tide. A pilgrim might vanish on the road. Words spoken in drink carried no guarantee of reconciliation, and so they were answered instead with fists or knives. Authorities understood this. Municipal statutes from Cologne to York attempted to limit tavern gatherings by requiring keepers to refuse service to large groups of strangers, fearing conspiracy as much as violence. Yet trade and travel ensured that strangers never ceased to come. The very economy of the medieval town depended on movement, and taverns, perched near markets, bridges, and gates, were where that movement paused. Thus the tavern became a stage for the unpredictable. It was a place where the world outside the walls pressed into the daily rhythm of the town, bringing foreign tongues, strange customs, and new tensions. Hospitality was its promise, but hostility was its frequent outcome. The clatter of dice across wooden tables was as familiar a sound in medieval taverns as the slosh of ale into mugs. Gambling, though frequently condemned by both church and civic authority, was a daily feature of tavern life, and it carried dangers as potent as drink itself. For men whose lives were bound by toil and repetition, the chance to risk coins on a throw of knucklebones or on the spin of a primitive wheel offered both escape and peril. Dice were the most common tools of chance. Made from bone, ivory, or wood, they were cheap, portable, and easy to conceal. Archaeological finds across Europe, from York to Lubeck, reveal how widespread the habit was. Rules of play varied, but the pattern was constant. A small stake escalated into a heated wager, and disputes over results often turned violent. In London's coroner's rolls of 1304, one case records a laborer stabbed after accusing his opponent of loading dice with lead, a charge that carried both financial and moral weight. Card-like games began to appear in Europe in the late 14th century, spreading from Italy through German and French towns. Their arrival only expanded the opportunities for conflict. Cards required a shared understanding of rules, and when those rules clashed between regions, suspicion of cheating arose quickly. A Florentine statute of 1376 specifically banned card games in taverns after repeated disturbances, noting that fights over unpaid debts had disrupted public order. Beyond dice and cards, wagers on physical contests filled the hours. Arm wrestling, or even throwing knives at tavern walls became occasions for betting. Money changed hands, tempers flared, and spectators pressed close, ready to cheer or jeer. The tight quarters amplified each shout until insults carried the weight of challenges. Chroniclers in 15th century Cologne describe a tavern fight where a wager on knife throwing ended with a man blinded when the blade slipped from its mark. Gambling also opened pathways to ruin. Wages earned through weeks of labor could vanish in a night. Town records from Paris in the early 15th century note repeated complaints by wives that husbands returned home penniless after evenings in the tavern, their household money lost to dice. In Nuremberg, ordinances attempted to limit betting stakes to prevent men from gambling away tools or clothing, yet pawnbrokers near taverns thrived on items traded by desperate gamblers seeking one more throw. Theft was another byproduct. Cheating was common, whether through weighted dice, marked cards, or collusion among players. When discovered, retaliation was swift. In 1397, Bruges records a tavern stabbing after a merchant accused a sailor of palming dice during a game. Witnesses claimed the argument lasted less than a minute before blades were drawn, underscoring how quickly suspicion translated into bloodshed. For authorities, the link between gambling and disorder was clear. Many towns banned dice games on holy days, while others restricted gambling altogether. In 1361, King Edward III of England issued a proclamation forbidding servants and apprentices from playing dice or cards, arguing that such distractions weakened discipline. Yet the bans rarely held. The appeal of quick fortune and the thrill of chance proved stronger than regulation. Tavern keepers, dependent on the extra custom gambling brought, seldom enforced prohibitions unless pressed by officials. The church was no less severe in its denunciations. Preachers railed against gambling as a sin that led to idleness, theft, and violence. Sermons likened dice to instruments of the devil, and ecclesiastical courts fined clerics found within taverns where games were played. Yet even churchmen were not immune. In Avignon during the papal residence of the 14th century, records survive of papal servants fined for gambling in local taverns, proof that moral prohibitions did little to extinguish the habit. What made tavern gambling especially volatile was the blend of chance, pride, and intoxication. To lose money sober was humiliation enough, but to lose it while drunk invited louder complaints, harsher words, and quicker hands reaching for knives. The tavern's confined space left little room for retreat, and once a crowd gathered, insults became spectacle. Every accusation of cheating was amplified by witnesses, and each demand for repayment became a test of honor. Thus, gambling in taverns did more than empty pockets. It strained friendships, provoked strangers, and fueled a cycle where one night's entertainment ended in wounds or death. For medieval towns, the tavern was not simply a house of drink, but a den where dice and daggers often lay only inches apart, waiting for a quarrel to close the distance. Taverns in medieval towns often sat at the edge of authority, tolerated yet mistrusted by those responsible for keeping the peace. While guild halls and markets were under constant supervision, taverns were places where law reached only reluctantly, and often too late. Their noise, their mixed crowds, and their late hours created conditions where watchmen hesitated to intervene unless summoned, and by then the damage was usually done. The urban watch was intended to patrol streets after dark, enforce curfews, and prevent disorder. In London, for example, a statute of 1285 required householders to take turns serving in the watch, patrolling with staff and lantern from dusk until dawn. In Paris, similar duties fell to the guet, men charged with keeping order in the narrow lanes. Yet taverns, with their open doors and glowing hearths, drew men from the cold and encouraged gatherings that ignored curfews. Watchmen were reluctant to enter these crowded rooms where they were outnumbered, mocked, and often resisted with force. Records from York in 1389 describe an incident where the night watch attempted to close a tavern after curfew. The customers, already drunk, turned on the guards, pelting them with mugs and driving them from the door. By the time reinforcements arrived, one watchman was dead from a knife wound, proof of how quickly tavern unrest could outmatch civic authority. Similar scenes were recorded in Cologne, where statutes repeatedly warned tavern keepers not to harbor men after curfew, a law broken more often than kept. The relationship between taverns and authority was complicated by economics. Town councils relied on taxes and license fees from taverns, and innkeepers cultivated customers by offering late-night entertainment. To shut taverns down entirely would damage trade and alienate workers who viewed them as necessary outlets. As a result, the law struck an uneasy balance. Taverns were permitted, but tavern violence was punished harshly once it spilled into the street. Riot was a constant fear. Chronicles of Lubeck in the 15th century describe how quarrels inside a tavern between foreign sailors and locals erupted into street fighting that lasted until dawn. Such incidents expose the weakness of night watches, composed of ordinary townsmen reluctant to confront armed and drunken crowds. In some cases, mayors called upon guild militias to restore order, a response more suited to suppressing revolt than handling a tavern brawl. Even when watchmen entered taverns, their presence was not neutral. Many were drawn from the same neighborhoods as the drinkers and carried their own loyalties and resentments. Accusations of favoritism were common. A tavern dispute in Bruges in 1417 turned deadly when the watch arrested one side but not the other, prompting relatives of the detained men to attack the guards the next day. What began as a quarrel over dice escalated into a vendetta involving two parishes, showing how the failure of impartial enforcement deepened divisions. The crown occasionally intervened directly. In 1331, Edward III of England ordered taverners in London to close at curfew, threatening heavy fines for disobedience. Yet only 2 years later, the mayor reported that the order was widely ignored. Taverns paid bribes to watchmen to look the other way, and officials themselves were not immune to late-night drinking. In Paris, ordinances against tavern disorder were renewed so frequently in the 14th century that their repetition alone demonstrates their ineffectiveness. Clashes between tavern-goers and the watch also reveal how fragile civic peace could be. Unlike the countryside, where lords' men enforced authority with mounted patrols, towns relied on untrained neighbors carrying staves. Against a crowd of armed drinkers, this force was inadequate. Chroniclers in Florence noted that watchmen avoided taverns entirely unless murder was reported. leaving lesser fights to burn themselves out. The result was that taverns became zones of semi-autonomy, governed by custom, reputation, and the strength of fists rather than statute. For medieval towns, this was a dangerous contradiction. Taverns were essential to hospitality, trade, and taxation, but they repeatedly undermined the credibility of civic order. Each night that watchmen passed by without entering, the tavern grew more firmly established as a space where law was negotiable, where violence might erupt unchecked, and where the authority of the city ended at the threshold. In medieval Europe, weapons were as common as belts or boots. Knives, daggers, and short swords accompanied men wherever they went, tools of daily life as much as instruments of defense. When these weapons entered the confined, volatile atmosphere of the tavern, their presence transformed minor quarrels into deadly encounters. Ale-soaked arguments that might elsewhere have ended in insults or shoves too often escalated into sudden flashes of steel. Knives were indispensable. Used for cutting food, carving wood, or mending harnesses, they hung at the belt of every laborer and merchant. Yet these same knives, once drawn in anger, were lethal in the close quarters of a tavern. Coroners' rolls from London in the early 14th century frequently record killings by knife at the alehouse, with disputes beginning over dice or spilled drink and ending with a fatal thrust to the chest. The ubiquity of knives meant that every quarrel carried the shadow of potential murder. Daggers, shorter but heavier than utility knives, were common among townsmen who wished to assert status or deter attack. In Paris, city ordinances of 1293 forbade citizens from carrying daggers into taverns, an order repeated several times in the 14th century, which indicates how widely it was ignored. Daggers were easily concealed beneath cloaks and readily drawn when voices rose. Chronicles from Ghent tell of a brawl in 1379 where a journeyman, mocked for losing at dice, stabbed his rival with a rondel dagger, the weapon's narrow blade slipping easily through a gap in his opponent's jerkin. Swords, though less universal, were not confined to knights. Prosperous merchants, officials, and soldiers of fortune carried them into towns, symbols of rank as well as protection. Their presence in taverns raised the stakes even higher. In 1415, a tavern in Lubeck erupted into chaos when two visiting Hanseatic merchants unsheathed their short swords during a quarrel over unpaid debts. The narrow room, filled with drinkers, became a battlefield. 3 men lay dead before the watch arrived. Such episodes underline how a single drawn sword could transform a crowded tavern into a place of carnage. Municipal governments recognized the danger. Statutes from Cologne, Bologna, and London all included attempts to restrict the carrying of swords or long knives within town walls, and especially within taverns. Yet enforcement was weak. Tavern keepers, reliant on paying customers, rarely refused entry to armed men. In some places, they kept buckets of sand or heavy staves behind the bar, a meager defense against the weapons their patrons carried. The culture of honor further magnified the risk. In a world where reputation was everything, an insult in a tavern could not be allowed to stand. To be called a cheat at dice, or to have one's cloak mocked, demanded satisfaction. Weapons at the belt made such satisfaction immediate. Chroniclers in Florence tell of a dispute in 1392 between 2 apprentices whose quarrel over a girl escalated when one reached for his knife. The fight drew others in, and within minutes the tavern was wrecked and 2 men dead. What might have ended in words or blows ended instead with blades, because weapons were never far from hand. Even attempts to regulate the matter often failed. In Oxford, university authorities repeatedly forbade students from carrying swords or daggers into taverns, fearing clashes between scholars and townsfolk. Yet court rolls are filled with cases of stabbings involving students, whose bravado and weapons combined to make them notorious troublemakers. In 1355, the street Scholastica's Day riots began with a tavern quarrel, a reminder of how weapons, drink, and insult could ignite violence that spread far beyond the tavern walls. Weapons also blurred the line between self-defense and aggression. A man who drew his knife claimed he acted to protect himself. His opponent claimed provocation. Courts struggled to untangle such disputes, often leaning on witness testimony that was itself colored by loyalty and bias. The very prevalence of weapons made impartial judgment difficult, for no one doubted that knives and daggers were a natural part of tavern life. Thus, the tavern stood as both a social hub and a killing ground. The presence of blades transformed it into a space where every quarrel carried mortal risk, and where the line between camaraderie and catastrophe was measured in inches of steel. The medieval tavern was not only a concern for town officials and watchmen, but also for the church, which viewed these establishments as dens of sin. From the pulpit, priests warned congregations that the alehouse was a doorway to damnation, a place where drunkenness, gambling, lust, and violence thrived beyond the reach of discipline. To step under its smoky roof was, in their eyes, to risk not only the body, but the soul. The church's hostility was rooted in Scripture. Sermons cited Proverbs' warnings against strong drink, and preachers compared taverns to the snares of the devil. In 13th century England, friars described alehouses as chapels of Bacchus, invoking the pagan god of wine to emphasize their corruption. Drunkenness was not only a vice but a mortal sin when it led to neglect of prayer, quarrels, or fornication. The association between alcohol and moral collapse was repeated endlessly from pulpits, shaping the way parishioners were taught to think about taverns. Moralists complained that taverns encouraged idleness. Men who should have been at work or prayer wasted hours at dice and drink, while women who entered risked their reputations entirely. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council had insisted that Christians avoid occasions of sin. Local bishops interpreted this as justification to denounce taverns. Pastoral manuals for priests listed the tavern as one of the chief places to question during confession. "Hast thou lingered in the alehouse?" asked one, equating time spent there with theft of time from God. The link between taverns and lust particularly troubled the clergy. Alewives were suspected not only of watering drink, but of tolerating prostitution under their roofs. In Paris, officials in the 14th century repeatedly fined taverns for harboring sex workers, a practice that blurred the line between drinking house and brothel. Preachers seized on these examples as proof that alehouses endangered chastity. In sermons preserved from Dominican friars in Cologne, taverns were described as the devil's bedroom, where modesty dissolved with every cup of ale. Gambling provoked equal condemnation. Dice games in taverns were seen as theft disguised as play, leading men to squander wages meant for their families. In 1369, Bishop Thomas Brinton of Rochester preached against taverns as places where the devil casts his dice, portraying them as workshops of avarice and despair. Such language reinforced the idea that the tavern was not merely a social hazard, but a spiritual trap that destroyed households and souls alike. The church also feared the way taverns drew people away from the rhythms of sacred life. Feast days, intended for worship, too often ended with processions spilling into alehouses. Records from York in 1427 describe clerics chastising parishioners who left vespers early to drink. Pilgrims, praised for their piety on the road, sometimes fell into tavern revels upon arrival in holy cities, provoking scandal. The contradiction between sacred journey and profane indulgence became a recurring theme in moral literature. Yet condemnation was never entirely effective. Tavern culture was too deeply woven into daily existence. Even clerics themselves were not immune. Episcopal registers contain numerous cases of priests disciplined for drinking and brawling in taverns. The church's struggle was not simply against lay vice, but against human weakness within its own ranks. Each scandal of a drunken monk or quarrelsome parish priest undermined the pulpit's authority, making taverns both a moral enemy and a mirror of the church's failings. To counter the lure of alehouses, the church offered alternatives. Confraternities and guilds sponsored communal feasts intended to keep celebration within bounds of piety. Sermons urged Christians to drink in moderation at home rather than risk their souls in taverns. Some towns saw attempts to establish sobriety houses tied to religious institutions, though these rarely endured. Ultimately, the tavern remained resilient, its draw too strong for prohibitions to erase. Still, the rhetoric mattered. By branding taverns as gateways to sin, the church helped shape social attitudes that justified regulation, suspicion, and even violence against them. The tavern's image as a place of temptation and ruin, was not only born from brawls and bloodshed, but cultivated deliberately by clerics who sought to guard their flocks. To step into a tavern was, in their sermons, to walk into the devil's embrace, a warning that echoed through every parish, even as the alehouse doors stayed open night after night. The medieval tavern was never just a place for ale and dice. Beneath its smoky rafters, another economy thrived, one of flesh and desire. Prostitution, long entwined with urban life, found in the tavern both a shelter and a stage. For weary travelers, lonely craftsmen, and restless sailors, the tavern offered not only drink but company, and often that company came at a price. Taverns and brothels were frequently neighbors, sometimes indistinguishable. In London, municipal records from the 14th century describe alehouses that doubled as houses of prostitution, blurring any boundary between drinking and sexual commerce. The same pattern appeared in Paris, Cologne, and Florence, where taverns were listed among the tolerated but regulated spaces for sex work. The combination was natural. Ale loosened purse strings and lowered inhibitions, while the tavern's crowded rooms provided anonymity in the bustle. Female tavern keepers, or alewives, were often accused of facilitating prostitution. Some acted as intermediaries, arranging meetings between patrons and sex workers in back rooms or upper chambers. Moralists and officials denounced this practice as a corruption of hospitality, but the profits were undeniable. In 15th century Lubeck, city fines against taverns caught harboring women of ill life reveal how widespread the arrangement was. For many taverns, the additional income helped offset taxes and licensing fees that otherwise strained their survival. The presence of prostitutes inside taverns added layers of risk. Encounters were rarely private. Drunken quarrels over payment or jealousy often erupted in public view. In 1399, a case in York records how a fight broke out between two sailors over a woman they both claimed to have paid, ending in a stabbing that drew the city watch. Such disputes were not rare, and the mixture of alcohol, weapons, and wounded pride made taverns especially combustible when sex work was involved. Authorities responded with mixed strategies. Some towns tolerated prostitution in designated districts, believing it preferable to clandestine encounters. In Paris, the bishop's court attempted to confine prostitutes to specific streets, yet taverns constantly drew them back into the city's heart. Municipal ordinances repeatedly banned prostitutes from drinking houses, but enforcement faltered. The very men charged with upholding order, guards, clerks, even priests, were among the tavern clientele, ensuring that prohibitions were inconsistently applied. For the church, the link between taverns and prostitution was proof of their sinful nature. Preachers railed against alehouses as brothels in disguise, where the virtues of chastity and fidelity dissolved. Dominican sermons from 14th century Germany described taverns as places where men drowned their senses in ale, then their souls in lust. Prostitution turned what might have been dismissed as mere drunkenness into mortal sin, reinforcing the tavern's image as a threat to salvation. The women themselves occupied an ambiguous position. Some prostitutes sought taverns for protection, knowing that public spaces with many witnesses offered more safety than isolated streets. Others were coerced into tavern work by innkeepers or pimps, trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. Court cases reveal instances of women suing tavern keepers for withholding earnings or subjecting them to violence, though success in such suits was rare. Their stories expose the precariousness of female life within the tavern economy. At times, prostitution inside taverns fed into larger disturbances. In Lubeck in 1483, a tavern brawl over a prostitute's favors escalated into a neighborhood riot, drawing dozens into the fray before the watch restored order. Chroniclers noted how quickly the private became public, how a whispered arrangement in a corner could ignite into chaos, spilling onto cobbled streets. These incidents illustrate how sex work inside taverns magnified the ever-present volatility of medieval urban life. Yet for all the danger and condemnation, prostitution persisted in taverns because demand persisted. The tavern condensed the essential ingredients: men with coin, alcohol to dissolve restraint, and rooms away from prying eyes. It was a marketplace of bodies woven into the fabric of medieval towns, tolerated enough to endure, but scandalous enough to remain a focus of outrage. In the smoky light of the tavern, desire mingled with disorder. What some patrons sought as fleeting comfort, others condemned as corruption. For the prostitute, the tavern could mean livelihood or exploitation, protection or peril. For the town, it meant another reason to view taverns as dangerous, not only for the knives drawn in drunken brawls, but for the sins whispered in shadowed corners, where commerce of the flesh blurred with the commerce of ale. The tavern was not only a haven for the thirsty, but also a hunting ground for thieves. Crowded rooms, heavy drink, and distracted patrons created the perfect setting for cutpurses to ply their craft. Medieval records are littered with cases where a night of drinking ended with a missing coin pouch or a dagger fight over stolen goods. The combination of dim lighting, close quarters, and loosened vigilance made taverns essential to the criminal economy of medieval towns. Pickpockets, or cutpurses, were common figures in these establishments. A man too drunk to guard his belt purse was an easy target. London's court rolls from the late 14th century include dozens of cases of men robbed inside taverns, often without realizing it, until long after they staggered into the street. A cutpurse needed only a moment of distraction, a toast, a jest, or a brawl, breaking out nearby, to draw his blade across a leather strap and vanish into the press of bodies. Taverns also served as meeting places for organized thieves. Unlike markets where officials maintained some oversight, the tavern provided the privacy of shadows and the noise of revelry to conceal whispered plans. Chroniclers in Cologne remark that bandits heading for the highways often first gathered in city alehouses to divide spoils or recruit new accomplices. In this way, taverns acted as recruitment grounds where local pickpockets could connect with more ambitious highwaymen. The highwayman, feared along rural roads, owed much of his success to the contacts and intelligence gained in taverns. Information about wealthy travelers, the routes they planned to take, and the guards they hired could be overheard from loose tongues after a few cups of wine. Inns and taverns situated near city gates or bridges became especially dangerous. A merchant boasting of profits on his way home from market might find himself followed at dawn by men who had listened closely the night before. Violence followed theft, as predictably as shadow followed flame. When victims realized their purses were missing, accusations flew and fights erupted. In 1372, records from York describe a case in which a cloth merchant accused a fellow drinker of robbing him in a tavern. The quarrel escalated into a fight that left one man dead and several arrested. Such cases show how quickly theft, when discovered, could transform a night of leisure into bloodshed. Women were not absent from this world. Some prostitutes doubled as pickpockets, taking advantage of drunken men in darkened corners. Court documents from Lubeck and Florence include references to women accused of both fornication and theft inside taverns, suggesting that sexual and criminal economies often overlapped. Their work was dangerous, as discovery meant beatings or worse, but the profits proved irresistible in cities where opportunities for poor women were scarce. Authorities attempted to police tavern theft with harsh punishments. In London, convicted cutpurses faced mutilation, with ears or hands removed as warnings to others. Highwaymen captured after plotting in taverns risked hanging. Yet despite these measures, the tavern's nature made it nearly impossible to cleanse. The constant flow of strangers, the haze of alcohol, and the press of bodies created an environment where surveillance faltered and criminals thrived. Tavern keepers themselves occupied a precarious position. Some colluded with thieves, accepting a share of stolen goods or providing shelter in exchange for coin. Others found themselves accused of negligence for failing to protect patrons. In Paris during the late 14th century, an ordinance required tavern keepers to report suspicious gatherings, a law almost impossible to enforce. Many keepers preferred silence, unwilling to alienate customers or invite reprisals from criminals. The danger extended beyond town walls. Highwaymen relied on taverns not only for intelligence, but also for refuge. After ambushing a caravan or robbing a traveler, they could melt back into the anonymity of an alehouse, blending with the nightly crowd. The same qualities that made taverns risky for honest patrons made them invaluable to outlaws. By the 15th century, urban governments increasingly viewed taverns as inseparable from the criminal underworld. They were places where stolen goods changed hands, where purses were cut, and where robbers plotted their next strike. To step inside a tavern was to risk not only drunken quarrels, but also the silent hand of the thief or the calculating gaze of the highwayman, waiting for the chance to turn ale-soaked carelessness into profit. When armies gathered, taverns filled. The presence of soldiers and mercenaries turned drinking houses into volatile spaces where military unrest collided with civilian life. Towns already wary of strangers dreaded the influx of armed men, for taverns became their first stop after pay was issued or battles ended. The clash between locals and soldiers, fueled by drink, often left broken tables, bloodied floors, and sometimes bodies in the street. Medieval chroniclers frequently noted that soldiers carried war into the tavern long before it reached the battlefield. In France, during the 100 Years' War, villages complained that taverns overflowed with men-at-arms who drank away their coin, fought each other, and assaulted townsfolk. In 1417, the city of Rouen petitioned the crown for stricter controls on soldiers in alehouses after repeated tavern riots left citizens too frightened to walk the streets at night. The crown's response, like most, was tepid. Soldiers were needed for war, and taverns were where they could be found. Mercenaries, in particular, unsettled towns. Unlike feudal levies tied to lords, mercenaries were professionals whose loyalty shifted with coin. German landsknechts, Italian condottieri, and free companies across Europe gained reputations not only for battlefield skill, but for tavern disorder. In Florence during the 1362, records describe mercenaries using taverns to recruit men, promising high pay for anyone willing to wield a sword. The same rooms echoed later, with fights over wages, women, and honor, often ending with civilians caught in the crossfire. Payment day magnified the risks. Soldiers paid after campaigns rushed to taverns to spend their wages, bringing heavy purses and little restraint. In London during the 1382, the Watch reported repeated incidents of brawls between archers and townsmen after coin flowed too freely across ale benches. Alehouses near the Tower and city gates were notorious for this, their keepers alternately profiting and fearing ruin depending on how violent their patrons became. Even before battle, taverns served as staging grounds. Soldiers awaiting orders or mustering in towns filled taverns with tense energy, and drunken disputes could erupt into melees that left men injured before they faced the enemy. Chroniclers of the Hussite Wars noted with grim irony that more than one soldier never reached the battlefield because of wounds inflicted in tavern quarrels the night before. For civilians, taverns in wartime were double-edged. They brought custom and coin from men flush with plunder, but also the constant threat of robbery and assault. In 1429, the town of Orléans complained that mercenaries billeted nearby spent nights in taverns harassing townsfolk, seizing food without payment, and threatening violence. Tavern keepers themselves walked a dangerous line, forced to serve armed men they could not refuse yet blamed when riots erupted. Authorities attempted regulation, but enforcement lagged behind reality. Ordinances in Paris, London, and Milan required taverners to limit service to soldiers or close during musters, yet soldiers ignored bans with impunity. In some cases, military commanders themselves used taverns for meetings, valuing their privacy and centrality. This blurred the line between military order and civilian disorder, further entrenching taverns as spaces where violence simmered. The presence of foreign troops intensified tensions. In 1474, during the Burgundian Wars, Swiss mercenaries passing through Strasbourg flooded taverns and clashed with locals over prices and insults, leading to days of unrest. Chroniclers recorded that the city watch avoided direct confrontation, fearing escalation against men trained for war. The tavern thus became a place where civilians learned firsthand the dangers of hosting armies, even when no formal battle loomed. Wartime taverns also spread rumors and panic. Soldiers, drunk and boastful, exaggerated victories or defeats, and townsfolk carried these stories into the streets. In this way, a careless tale told over ale could ripple through a city, undermining morale or sparking unrest. Authorities recognized the threat but found no way to contain it without closing taverns entirely, a measure few dared attempt given the soldiers' reliance on them. In every war-touched town, the tavern became both magnet and menace. It was the soldier's refuge, the mercenary's marketplace, and the townsman's nightmare. Where weapons, coin, and alcohol mixed, violence was never far behind, and taverns bore the scars of conflicts fought within their walls as surely as the battlefields beyond the gates. In the political life of a medieval town, the tavern was more than a place to drink. It was a forum where grievances were aired, rumors circulated, and schemes took root. Unlike the council chamber, open only to officials, or the church, where speech was constrained by ritual, the tavern permitted unguarded talk. With ale flowing and strangers welcome, words spilled freely, and those words sometimes shook kingdoms. Authorities across Europe recognized the tavern's role in fostering dissent. In England during the late 14th century, taverns became gathering points for the supporters of John Wycliffe and the Lollard movement. Sermons critical of the clergy circulated most effectively not in pulpits, but over ale benches. In 1414, after the failed Lollard uprising, royal records specifically listed taverns in London and Oxford as places where subversive talk had spread. The crown understood that seditious ideas could find more willing ears in smoky rooms than in open squares. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 offers another example. Chroniclers note that taverns in Essex and Kent were sites where men discussed tax grievances and shared anger at local officials. The poll tax, deeply resented across the countryside, became a subject of tavern debate as laborers drank together after market days. When rebellion finally broke out, authorities traced its sparks back to alehouses, where men had first voiced their refusal to pay. On the continent, similar patterns emerged. In 15th century Flanders, taverns in Ghent and Bruges served as meeting points for guild members, plotting strikes and uprisings. The dense clusters of drinking houses near cloth markets meant that disputes between merchants and artisans carried straight into tavern halls. Records from 1449 describe officials closing several taverns in Bruges after they were identified as sites where guildsmen had drafted demands against city rulers. The suppression, however, did little to halt the unrest as new gatherings formed elsewhere. Even in times of relative peace, taverns amplified political rumor. During the Wars of the Roses in England, towns were awash in gossip about which noble held the upper hand. Reports in London's court rolls show men accused of sowing discord by repeating tavern tales about the fates of lords in battle. One case in 1461 describes a man arrested after claiming in a tavern that Edward, Earl of March, had been slain. Though untrue, such words could demoralize supporters and embolden opponents, proving that tavern talk had consequences beyond its walls. Governments sought to control this speech. In 1402, the city of Paris issued an ordinance forbidding taverners from allowing political discussions in their establishments, threatening fines and closure. The measure was impossible to enforce, for political discussion was inseparable from the drinking that fueled it. In Bologna, similar bans were imposed in the 15th century, citing fears that taverns were harboring conspiracies against city magistrates. Despite these efforts, the alehouse remained one of the few public spaces where free talk persisted. Plots against rulers also found their roots in taverns. In Prague, chroniclers of the early 15th century described Hussite sympathizers using taverns to coordinate actions against Catholic authorities. Likewise, in German towns during the 1522, taverns provided cover for radicals of the early Reformation to gather, their meetings disguised as drinking sessions. The combination of privacy, noise, and plausible deniability made taverns ideal places for planning unrest. The authorities' fear was not unfounded. Taverns could transform from spaces of casual talk to rallying points for mobs. In 1487, during unrest in York, a tavern in Micklegate became the headquarters for rebels plotting to support the pretender Lambert Simnel. Witnesses later testified that men pledged loyalty to him over ale cups before marching into the streets. This pattern repeated in countless towns where rebellion brewed not in castles or manors, but in the humbler surroundings of tavern halls. The political power of taverns rested on their accessibility. Anyone could enter, whether wealthy merchant, poor laborer, or itinerant stranger. That openness meant grievances that would never reach official ears circulated instead through informal channels. In an age when printed pamphlets were rare, tavern conversation was one of the fastest means of spreading information, and authorities' attempts to silence it only proved how central these places were to political life. The medieval tavern was not only a place of drink and dispute, but also a place of danger in quieter, less visible ways. Fire, filth, and disease were constant threats, woven into the very fabric of daily tavern life. To step across the threshold was to enter an environment that could imperil as easily as it entertained. The first and most dreaded threat was fire. Taverns were built largely of timber, thatch, and wattle, with floors of packed earth or warped planks, all highly flammable. Inside, open hearths glowed, candles guttered in iron holders, and torches sputtered on walls darkened by smoke. In rooms crowded with men, where ale sloshed and tempers flared, sparks often found easy purchase. Records from York in 1423 mention a tavern blaze that leapt from a candle knocked over during a fight, consuming not only the alehouse but 3 adjacent homes. In London, authorities repeatedly fined tavern keepers who left fires untended, yet accidents recurred with deadly frequency. For towns built close and tight, the tavern was often the tinderbox that threatened entire neighborhoods. Equally dangerous was filth. Taverns generated refuse in staggering amounts: broken cups, rotting food scraps, ale dregs, and human waste. Few establishments had proper privies. Instead, chamber pots were emptied into the street or alley, where they mingled with horse dung and kitchen slops. The stench clung to tavern walls, drawing vermin in droves. In Paris, civic records from 1388 fined several taverners for maintaining refuse heaps outside their doors, accusing them of fouling the public way. Municipal ordinances across Europe tried to regulate the problem, demanding that taverns keep middens at a distance, but enforcement was lax. For customers, the experience of drinking in such conditions was often one of endurance as much as enjoyment. The consequence of such filth was sickness. Taverns were fertile grounds for fevers and contagion. Crowded, airless rooms where men coughed and sweated side by side offered ideal conditions for disease to spread. During outbreaks of plague, authorities frequently ordered taverns shut, fearing that shared cups and crowded benches magnified the danger. In Lubeck in 1402, a tavern was blamed for spreading fever after sailors from abroad drank with locals and soon afterward fell ill. Similar reports appear in English towns, where outbreaks of sweating sickness in the late 15th century were tied to drinking houses packed with laborers and strangers. Food and drink themselves could be vectors of illness. Ale was often brewed in haste, souring in poorly cleaned barrels. Cheap wine imported from abroad might be adulterated with lead or other additives to improve flavor. Meat pies sold in taverns were sometimes made from spoiled cuts, their rancid odor masked with heavy spices. Court rolls from Norwich in 1391 include a case against a taverner accused of selling corrupt wine that caused sickness in the belly of several good men. The line between nourishment and poison was thin, and those who drank deeply accepted risk along with refreshment. Even the physical structure of taverns posed hazards. Floors were uneven and slick with spilled drink, leading to falls. Low ceilings filled with smoke from poor chimneys choked patrons until eyes streamed and lungs burned. Bed chambers above, rented by travelers or prostitutes, were cramped and stifling, breeding grounds for lice and fleas. Chroniclers, writing of Oxford in the 15th century, complained that tavern beds spread itch and ague faster than the scholars' debates. The very spaces meant for rest could instead deliver weeks of misery. Authorities attempted to curb these dangers, but with limited success. Fire ordinances demanded that taverns keep water buckets ready, and health decrees required waste to be carried beyond city walls. Yet taverns multiplied faster than regulations could contain them. The profits were too great, the demand too steady. For every tavern shut down for filth or fire risk, Another opened nearby, promising cheap ale and warm company. Customers were willing to overlook the risks in exchange for the tavern's rewards. In the end, the tavern embodied the precariousness of medieval urban life. It was both hearth and hazard, offering shelter and sociability, while threatening ruin through accident, contagion, or neglect. Fire, filth, and fever were not exceptional intrusions but expected companions, reminders that every mug lifted in celebration carried with it unseen perils. The tavern keeper stood at the center of a volatile world. Neither wholly master of his house nor mere servant to his guests, he bore responsibility for order, profit, and survival in a place where chaos was never far away. To keep a tavern in a medieval town was to walk a constant line between prosperity and peril, facing dangers from customers, neighbors, and authorities alike. A tavern was first and foremost a business, and the keeper's livelihood depended on satisfying a steady stream of patrons. That meant keeping ale fresh, food tolerable, and benches filled. Yet, quality cost money. Some taverners brewed their own ale, others purchased from local brewers, but all were tempted to stretch supply with water or substitute weaker grains. Municipal records across Europe are filled with fines for taverners caught selling short measures or corrupt drink. In London in 1375, several alehouse keepers were dragged before the mayor for diluting wine, accused of cheating both townsmen and travelers. Such practices risked ruin if discovered, yet without them, many taverners could not survive the lean months. The tavern keeper's second challenge was maintaining order. Customers came armed with knives, cudgels, or swords, and disputes over dice, debts, or insults could erupt at any moment. The keeper had to quell quarrels without alienating paying guests. Some employed servants or hired muscle to act as bouncers, men whose presence at the door was meant to remind patrons of restraint. In Bruges, a tavern regulation of 1418 required keepers to ensure fights were broken up swiftly, holding them liable if blood was spilled on their premises. The law recognized that the keeper was both host and warden, expected to prevent disorder even as he encouraged men to drink deeply. Women added further complexity. Tavern wives or widows often ran establishments in their own right, brewing ale and keeping house. Their presence could attract custom but also suspicion, for moralists accused female keepers of fostering prostitution. In Norwich in 1429, one widow was fined for allowing women of light fame to frequent her tavern. Yet many towns relied on women to brew and sell ale, and for some, tavern keeping was the only way to support a household. Their dilemma was sharper still: to draw enough customers to survive without drawing the attention of church or court. Debt was another hazard. Many patrons drank on credit, promising to pay after harvest or when wages arrived. Tavern accounts from German towns in the 15th century show pages filled with unpaid tallies. Some settled months later, others never at all. A tavern keeper who pressed too hard risked violence, one too lenient risked ruin. To manage this, many kept a chalkboard on the wall, where each drink was marked with a stroke, an open ledger of trust and tension. The keeper also faced the scrutiny of neighbors. Taverns were noisy places, spilling song and argument into the street late into the night. Residents complained of sleeplessness, of drunken men vomiting at their doors, of refuse left to rot in the lane. Complaints recorded in Dijon in 1397 described neighbors begging the council to shut a tavern whose nightly uproar kept them from prayer and rest. To run a tavern was to risk hostility from those who lived nearby, even as one relied on their occasional custom. Finally, there was the ever-present authority of town and church. Taverners were taxed, inspected, and accused more often than most tradesmen. Weights and measures were checked by officials. Ale quality was tested by sworn tasters. Licenses were required and could be revoked at a hint of scandal. To host a meeting of discontented artisans or harbor a fugitive guest could bring charges of conspiracy. For all their service to urban life, tavern keepers were regarded with suspicion, their houses seen as breeding grounds of disorder. Yet despite these perils, men and women continued to keep taverns, and some grew wealthy from the trade. A popular house near a market gate or bridge, could draw steady traffic, and a keeper with wit and firmness could turn chaos into coin. The tavern keeper's dilemma was thus the very heart of the alehouse: to foster merriment without letting it descend into mayhem, to court profit while warding off peril. It was a precarious balance, and many failed, but those who succeeded became fixtures of the medieval town, both envied and mistrusted, indispensable yet forever on the edge of danger. The tavern was a house of paradox, open to all yet judged differently depending on who entered. For peasants, the tavern offered a rare reprieve from the weight of toil, a place where community could form over shared ale and weary laughter. For nobles, it was a site of danger and disgrace, a place their status forbade, yet their curiosity sometimes compelled them to enter. Within those same smoke-darkened walls, men of the lowest and highest stations found contrasting fates, for what was refuge to one was shame to the other. For the peasant or day laborer, life was a rhythm of hardship. Days spent in the fields or at the forge left few pleasures, and ale was one of the few affordable indulgences. A cup of strong drink shared with neighbors turned labor into fellowship, binding men and women in stories and songs. Records from English manorial courts in the 14th century describe peasants fined for lingering too long at alehouses, evidence of how taverns became an extension of village life. A peasant's presence there was expected, if not always approved. It was the one place where laughter might rise above the noise of work, where the humblest man might forget his burdens for a night. The tavern also provided shelter. In towns, peasants who came to market found warmth by the hearth and a bench to rest weary legs. Pilgrims and rural folk visiting for festivals or fairs could count on alehouses to provide cheap food and a bed, even if only of straw in a shared loft. For the lower orders, the tavern was not merely a drinking place, but a necessary refuge within the hostile landscape of urban life. It softened the edge of poverty, even as it sometimes worsened it when debts went unpaid. For nobles, the tavern posed an opposite problem. A knight or lord was expected to drink in the hall of his own manor, or at the banquets of his peers, not in the dim common rooms of tradesmen and strangers. Chroniclers often used the tavern as a symbol of dishonor when describing nobles who fell from grace. A 13th century French poem mocked a minor lord who squandered his inheritance drinking with butchers in a Paris tavern, portraying his fall as not only financial but moral. To sit on a rough bench, shoulder to shoulder with common men, was to risk one's reputation. Yet temptation drew some nobles into these forbidden spaces. Anonymous chronicles of 15th century London hint at young squires who slipped into cheapside taverns, eager for dice games or secret trysts. There, stripped of their household retainers and noble decorum, they could indulge impulses denied in the hall, but such ventures rarely ended without scandal. In 1412, a London coroner recorded the death of a young esquire stabbed in a tavern brawl, his presence there noted with clear disapproval. The tavern magnified his disgrace, not merely that he died by violence, but that he died in such a place. For nobles who traveled, taverns sometimes became unavoidable. On pilgrimage or campaign, even lords found themselves in towns where private lodging was scarce. In these cases, they might occupy a private chamber upstairs, carefully apart from the noisy crowd below. Still, the association lingered. To be forced into a tavern was to endure necessity rather than seek comfort, and poets often framed such moments as humiliations for men of high birth. The contrast between peasant refuge and noble shame shaped the way taverns were policed. Authorities tolerated peasant presence, knowing it kept the lower orders contained, but noble presence threatened scandal. When riots broke out, chroniclers were quick to note the involvement of men of rank, treating their presence as a moral failing. The same act, a brawl, a drunken jest, a wager gone wrong, was judged far more harshly when committed by a knight than a plowman. Thus the tavern revealed the contradictions of medieval society. It was at once the poor man's hearth and the rich man's ruin, a space where drink could bind a village or disgrace a lineage. The same smoke, the same ale, the same dice rattled in the hands of both, but the meaning was transformed by class. For the peasant, it was reprieve. For the noble, it was risk. And in that tension, the tavern exposed the fragility of honor and the resilience of survival, serving as both shelter and snare in the fabric of medieval town life. The dangers of the tavern did not end when the doors closed. Some of the most violent consequences began once its patrons spilled into the streets, drunk, armed, and unwilling to let grievances fade with the night. Midnight brawls were a familiar feature of medieval towns, when crowded alehouses released their patrons into narrow lanes already tense under curfew. What began as an argument over dice, a shouted insult, or a spilled cup of ale often erupted into running fights that drew in bystanders and alarmed authorities. The layout of towns worsened this chaos. Streets were poorly lit, relying on moonlight or the flicker of torches carried after dark. In London, municipal records from the late 14th century frequently mentioned disturbances near Cheapside and Southwark, where groups of men poured into lanes after last drinks. The city watch, tasked with enforcing curfew, was too small to confront such crowds. Their hesitation allowed quarrels to spread unchecked, turning private disputes into neighborhood clashes. Paris faced similar problems. A 1,382 ordinance banned tavern keepers from serving ale after the evening bell, yet the law was widely ignored. Patrons brought their anger into the alleys of the Latin Quarter or along the Seine. Chroniclers complained that respectable citizens feared to walk after dark, for drunken fights could appear suddenly, armed with daggers, staves, or stones pulled from the street. These conflicts rarely stayed contained. Shouting drew in neighbors, apprentices, and passers-by until a tavern quarrel became a street riot. Curfew laws tried to limit unrest. In York, during the 15th century, bells rang at 9 to close taverns. Yet court rolls record many cases of drunken men ignoring the order, prowling the streets looking for quarrels. In 1472, one such incident ended in blood when a gang of drinkers attacked a watchman who had ordered them home. Their trial described the men as spoiled with ale and incapable of reason, proof of how tavern disorder became civic disorder. The social mix heightened the danger. Sailors with wages in their pockets, apprentices resentful of their masters, and pilgrims jostling for lodging all left taverns at the same hour, their tempers colliding in the streets. In coastal towns like Lubeck and Marseille, the combination of foreign crews and locals produced especially volatile nights. Dockside taverns emptied into streets where rival groups clashed until guards were summoned from the harbor gates. Records from Lubeck in 1419 describe a battle of more than 50 men after a quarrel between Hanseatic sailors and townsmen, leaving several dead and many injured. Weapons made these fights deadlier. Inside a tavern, crowded quarters limited the use of long swords, but once outside, men had room to swing freely. Daggers drawn inside were replaced with polearms or bows fetched from homes. Neighbors awoken by the noise often joined in with their own grievances, transforming private quarrels into communal fights. In London in 1393, a dispute between two shoemakers at the Sign of the Cock spread into the street until nearly 100 people were involved, requiring royal officials to intervene. Women were not absent. Alewives trying to protect their taverns sometimes followed brawlers outside, while prostitutes caught in disputes between clients were drawn into the violence. Court records from Bruges in 1426 describe an alewife who attempted to pull two men apart after they left her tavern fighting, only to be struck down herself. Such accounts reveal how tavern violence, once outside, drew in entire communities regardless of age or sex. Authorities feared the political implications as much as the bloodshed. Riots beginning in taverns sometimes became vehicles for wider discontent. A tax grievance or resentment toward officials might be voiced in drink, then shouted louder in the streets once curfew fell. Chroniclers in Flanders noted that uprisings often started with ale-fueled gatherings that spilled out of taverns, making them impossible to dismiss as private quarrels. Midnight brawls exposed the fragility of urban order. The tavern's walls could not contain the mix of alcohol, grievances, and weapons, and once its doors opened, violence flowed into the arteries of the town. Curfews, ordinances, and watch patrols could only respond after the fact, rarely preventing the spark. For medieval townsfolk, the tolling of the evening bell was not only a call to rest, but also a reminder that peace depended on whether taverns emptied quietly or whether the streets became battlefields before dawn.